Here we go, get comfy, slow your breathing and let the world get quiet. Tonight we're visiting a missing chapter of Earth's own diary, a prehistoric time hole so huge it erases 1 billion years. Imagine turning a stone page and the next page is 1 billion years later. Where did the middle go? That's our hook, our lullaby, and our little mystery. If you use these to fall asleep, that's the point. Before we drift off, tell me in the comments, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it for you right now? August 1869 folds into the canyon like a hot breath, and the river says hush. 10 men in 4 wooden boats ride the pulse of water, gear lashed down with rough rope, powder kegs and flour sacks and damp blankets wedged between oars and ribs. At the lead sits a compact figure with a broad-brimmed hat pulled low and a right sleeve pinned neatly at the shoulder, a quiet correction that strangers always notice first and friends eventually forget. John Wesley Powell keeps his balance with hips and eyes, reading the river the way he reads rock, by patterns, by scars, by what refuses to pretend. The war that took his arm gave him a calm he wears like a tool. Alarms that rattle other men arrive to him as information. The Green River hums under him, the oars go in, the boat noses forward, and the canyon rises as if the earth is inhaling. He's not supposed to be here, at least not according to sensible lives mapped by college payrolls and family advice. Illinois still holds his chalkboard and a room of the students who memorized mineral names for examinations they will later forget. But Powell's classroom today has moving walls and a syllabus written in bands of colour so bright they look wet. He taught that oldest lies below, youngest above, the grand simplicity of stratigraphy, the way time stacks with the patience of snowfall. Here those lessons tower over him, sandstones the colour of rusted coins, limestones pale as bone, shales as fine as dark as soot caught in paper, each layer a page, each grain a letter, each fossil, where one appears, a small illustration in the margin. He runs his palm along the wall at every eddy, the river keeping count with little taps against the hull. There is no map that anyone trusts. Resupplies a rumour tucked into a knapsack, sky by day, rock by night, black water stitching them forward when the moon agrees. They carry the simple wealth of 19th century expeditions, flour, bacon, coffee, tools, journals, sketchbooks, barometers, something like faith. The boats creak when the current flexes them. Men speak in short sentences because the canyon swallows anything longer, and because long sentences tempt arrogance. Sawbacks, careful laughter, blistered hands, and the soft quarrels that come when hunger is close enough to sit down with you. Every so often the river slips them a gift, an easy tongue of slack water, a glimpse of goat on a ledge, a fold in the rock that shows something private, and Powell, who has taught himself to notice before naming, stores the gifts in a part of his mind that is clean and fireproof. The canyon walls are a library of seasons, storms and seas layered one upon another. He sees tidal flats cast in stone, crossbeds that freeze ancient winds mid-gesture, ripple marks crisp as yesterday's comb lines. Here and there a polished pebble locked in place, the sole survivor of a vanished river's bed. When the light swings low, iron-rich beds glow as if they remember heat. In narrow stretches, the skies are ribboned the colour of milk. In wide amphitheatres, the daylight spills and eddies like water over a shelf. The men say the walls are closing in. Powell says the walls are opening out, into time. On a calm reach he takes out his notebook. He draws the cliff in patient strokes. Base, mid, cap, the supporting slants and the stubborn verticals, the faint telling lines that separate one story from the next. He notes grain size, colour changes, the angle of bedding, the way a thin limestone pinches out and reappears like a thought trying not to be lost. The routine of observation smooths the day's roughness. Sketch, glance, measure with the eye, label. Hat brim shades the page. The boats drift. A man in the second boat hums a hymn he doesn't quite remember. A cedar branch turns in a back eddy. a green hand waving them onward. By now, Powell has the canyon's grammar in his bones, old at the bottom, young at the top, pauses written as pale surfaces, abrupt changes marked by erosional teeth. He teaches this grammar to his men in the simplest way, by pointing, because the river has taught him to conserve words. Older, he says, touching a dark, tight rock. Younger, he says, laying his hand on the buff layer above. The men nod, not because they will become geologists, but because nodding is participation, and participation is warmth. The day arches on a hot hinge, cicadas rasping like stitches pulling shut. Then, a kink in the river, a tightening of the current, and they enter a bend where the walls wear two very different faces separated by a line cleaner than chance. Powell sees it first the way you sometimes sense rain before you smell it. A coherence that makes everything else feel slightly out of tune. Below the rock is hard, crystalline, toughened by old pressure, gneiss and schist and granite dressed in darks and greys, twisted like cooled smoke, like cloth wrung until the pattern bleeds. Above, the rock is courteous and orderly, horizontal beds set one on another with the discretion of a careful mason, sandstones and limestones and shales that speak the common language of weather and water. Between them runs a contact so precise it looks drawn, not a messy fade, not a rough transition, but a boundary like a blade laid flat. Powell's oar feathering stops. The boat drifts. His jaw shifts as if he is tasting the seam. He has taught for years that contacts tell you whether you're missing minutes or millennia. A soft, uneven surface with channels and pebbles promises a small pause, a storm season, a river's brief tantrum. But a level plain that carries one world of rock beneath another and leaves no trace of the middle is a different statement altogether. He feels for the part of his notebook that can carry this clean shock. The word that will later become a banner in geology, unconformity, is available to him. But what he needs first is the shape of his own attention. He draws the line. He makes the lower rock dark, the upper pale. He shades the twist below, the tidy bedding above. He writes no exclamation marks. The river does the exclaiming. He orders an eddy stop. The oars bite, the boat noses into quiet, and he steps onto a slanted ledge where heat leaks from stone as if the day had been poured there and left to set. With his remaining hand and the slight weight of his body, he tests the lower rock. It answers with the stubbornness of deep time. He kneels and runs fingertips along the contact. It is immaculate the way a healed bone is immaculate. You know there was trauma because of the perfection of the mend. He looks for clues that would soften the conclusion. Weathered rinds, angular lag, the casual debris of ordinary hiatus. But the seam is spare and ceremonial. Old world below, young world above, and the handshake between them leaves out what courtesy would normally include. He begins to count, not aloud, but in the slow arithmetic that field geologists keep behind the eyes. Ages he knows from other places start to line up. The crystalline basement can be ancient past saying. Some pieces are 1 billion and more. The lowest of the younger beds, by their simple fossils and their grain, suggest eras he can bracket closer to 500 million. He doesn't need precision today to recognise the order of magnitude. Hundreds upon hundreds of millions simply not present, not transitioned through, but skipped, as if a storyteller finished chapter 3 and opened at chapter 12 with no apology. It is not the presence of the line that startles him. Lines are expected. It is the emptiness it implies. Powell has stood on battlefields where the ground kept secrets badly. He has taught students that absence in a ledger means something burned or never was. He is cautious by training, but he also respects plain statements. The canyon is making one. He walks the seam, tracing the boundary with a finger as though following a shoreline on a map, and every few yards the same message repeats with liturgical calm. Beneath me, heat and pressure and crystalline order. Above me, water-laid stories in beds. Between us, nothing that shows. The sun shifts. The line keeps its poise. A swallow's shadow skims the contact and is gone. From the boats, the men call soft questions. Anything. The kind of inquiry that includes its own answer. Powell answers with 2 words. A boundary. And the tone is enough to quiet them. He's already thinking beyond this wall to other walls, to whether this clarity is a local quirk or a continental habit. The idea travels faster than the expedition ever will. If the same seam appears again downriver, or in other canyons or on distant plateaus, then the absence is not an accident of this bend, but a structure of history. The thought is large without being loud. It lands in him with the weight of a hand on a shoulder. He sketches again, slower, adding little notes to himself that no publication will ever need but his memory will. Basement, foliated, contact sharp, overlying, horizontal, coarse to fine, no basal conglomerate observed, river level plus 12 feet. A fly lands in the crease of the book. He lifts it away gently, as if it too were part of the record. He marks the sun's angle, the boat positions, the flow's mood. Larger than morning, less than spring flood. He's measuring not for bureaucracy but for return, for the future him or someone like him who will want to stand in this exact hush again and check the line with their own hand. When they push off, the river takes them with a soft shouldering. The seam rides beside them for a while, then folds behind a spur. Then it appears again around the next bend because it is not a line on a wall but a plane that slices through the canyon's turns with its own calm geometry. Once, where a talus cone drapes down, he loses it. Then 100 yards later, where weather has kept its edge sharp, he sees it bright and clear, and a relief he hadn't admitted washes through him. This is not a trick of lighting or a whim of a single outcrop. This is architecture. As afternoon leans toward evening, the canyon changes register. Swallows trade for bats. The water darkens from green to an ink that keeps the sky's last colour folded inside it. A smell of wet iron rises from the boat's ribs. They pull up on a gravel bar just large enough to persuade itself that it is a beach. Fire scratches light onto the underside of an overhang. Bacon snaps in a pan. Coffee sings a thin brown song. The men count rations the way gamblers count chips, and someone tells a short story with a good last line, and no one laughs loudly because the canyon edits volume. Powell eats slowly, looking without staring at the wall across the water, at the place where old and young shake hands and refuse to tell what passed between. Later, when the fire has gentled to a red thought and the voices have thinned, he opens the notebook one more time. He draws the river as a simple line. He draws the seam crossing beneath the river at a slight angle, a reminder to himself that contacts travel underground like ideas moving under a crowd. He writes the words, "Great Unconformity," and then scratches the question, "Mark lighter." Not because he is surer than he was, but because he knows the question will not be answered by punctuation. Sleep comes to the camp in tidy pieces. First the shoulders, then the hands, then the eyes. The river does not sleep. It rehearses all night the patient syllables it will speak tomorrow against stone. Powell lies with his hat over his face and listens. He can hear small negotiations in the dark, the pop of a cooling rock, the faint shift of gravel under tiny feet, the quiet correction of current on a boulder's flank. The seam he found today does not announce itself, does not shimmer or hum. It exists with the same unemphatic authority as a horizon. He thinks of classrooms and chalk dust, and the fine relief of a student's face when a picture finally resolves. He imagines standing before a map that shows the West not as blank but as patterned with this long, sly plane, and the act of pointing to it with the sleeve that ends too soon. He imagines a future visitor resting their palm on that same line, and feeling as he felt, the clean absence that is also a presence. Somewhere upriver a nightbird drops its single note into the dark like a pin into cloth. Somewhere downriver the seam continues, indifferent, crossing the unseen bends and the night still to come. The boats hitch softly on their ropes. Tomorrow they will follow the water into new turns and new walls, and he will carry the line with him the way a sentence unfinished carries its own momentum. a pause that is not an ending but a breath before the next word. The canyon's line lingers in your mind like a thin thread stretched taut between centuries, and once you've seen it, you start to see it everywhere, even with eyes closed. Not just a boundary in one river bend, not a quirk of a single wall, but a grammar mark used across the planet's manuscript. Old crystalline basement, its minerals aligned like the grain in seasoned wood, meets younger, water-laid beds stacked neatly, and between them, air where time should be. A page gone missing is an accident. Whole chapters excised in the same way on different continents begin to look like policy. The Earth is consistent even in how it loses things. Imagine shelves of stone as high as weather allows you to picture, each layer a long, patient paragraph. In some places, the letters are big and bold, sand grains you can pinch between finger and thumb. In other places, the letters are small, silt smoothed to a satin finish, and where lime built slow cities of shells, the sentences gleam pale and tight. Then picture a careful hand running along a line, lifting everything that once sat between two surviving chapters: storm years, quiet seabeds, river wanderings, buried soils. The lower chapter is metamorphic, cooked and pressed until its original words blur into banded music. The upper is clear, horizontal, legible. The missing interval is not scribbled out. It is cleanly, almost gently, absent. Far away from Powell's River, a cliff in a cold sea wind holds the same calm contradiction. At a shore where gulls write their vowels on the air, you can stand with one boot on rock old enough to have seen continents you don't have names for, and the other boot on a younger bed that remembers only shallows and sunlight. The line between them is as straight-faced as a sworn statement. A scholar with a coat turned up against the spray once placed a hand there and felt the universe make room for time scales that could not fit in the textbooks of his youth. That feeling repeats for anyone who tries, the body measuring the smoothness and the mind measuring the silence. Cross an ocean in your thoughts and you're in a shield country where lakes shine like coins thrown into a green purse of spruce. Here the old rock does not merely underlie, it is the country itself, worn to its architecture. Yet even here, where the basement is the surface, there are places where younger sandstones sit politely on the elder's shoulders, as if a child had fallen asleep on a grandparent during a long afternoon. The contact looks effortless. The effort is in the vanished miles of stone that once lay between. Someone once camped beside such a seam and cooked a simple dinner, and after the dishes were rinsed in lake water, they lay back on a warm boulder, feeling with their spine what the palms had told them earlier, that the planet edits with a steady hand. Walk the red heart of a desert where lizards keep their own counsel, and the heat sifts the day into mirage. In a canyon there, a thin shadow line crosses an amphitheatre of colour, and once you notice it, it becomes the horizon that matters. The lower rock, dark and crystalline, holds a pattern like frozen current. Above, cross-bedded sandstones lean at angles that freeze wind in mid-sculpt. No gravelly lag sits at the boundary to soften the jump. No transitional beds cushion the shift. Old and young meet like two strangers who share a language without sharing a history. And in the south, in dry ranges where morning light is an instrument that plays every ridge in turn, you see it again, walking along a spur that falls away to wide, quiet country. The basement remains a tough underfoot, sparkly with stubborn minerals, and then without fanfare the rock above resets to a different logic. Bedded, rhythmic, the handwriting of seas that understood tides. If you press your ear to the contact, there is no whisper of what was removed. Silence is the witness. Once you know to look, even cities offer evidence. A building stone in a wall, a polished slab in a lobby, a block serving as someone's garden step. One half the age of heroic myths, the other half merely venerable, and the clean plain between them. The world's surfaces carry old stories into ordinary days the way pockets carry lint, not valued, not intended, and everywhere. People pass, late for their trains, and the line does nothing to announce itself. The line does not need an audience. The scale of the absence is the scale that makes human certainty wobble. Think of a calendar not of months but of eras, and then think of a pen crossing out the long stretch from one equinox to the next, while leaving the entries before and after intact. Books about fossils show a wealth of creatures rising in a burst of invention, eyes and shells and strategies. But if you flip backward expecting a long sequence of steps, you land on bedrock where pressure has erased the earlier notes. The mind wants continuity. The rock offers a jump cut. None of this is a complaint. The missing is information. A smooth, planar contact that spans valleys and ridges and appears again across seas says that time wasn't merely quiet, it was actively removed. Rivers can do that if they're given long enough and a slope to encourage confidence. Ice can do it if it comes wearing enough patience and weight. Uplift can lay a hand under old rock and raise it into weather's reach, and weather can work with small tools for grand results. The line says something about scale and persistence, and the way forces add up when no one is keeping score for them. If you could move through the vanished interval as a ghost, what would you see? Possibly mountains that have no names now, lifting and leaning under their own weight until frost and rain unstitched them. Possibly broad shields of rock exposed like shoulders, their minerals reacting with air and water and slow chemistry that eats carbon from the sky and lays clays at their feet. Possibly seas that opened and closed, shelves that grew wide and bright and then sank under their own sediments, coastlines that wandered without memory of nations. All of that could happen, and then the product of all that happening, layers upon layers, could be gathered up and carried away grain by grain until only a floor remained, smooth enough for new chapters to begin. The eye, trained or not, cherishes a storyline. It wants to see the small bridging beds, the hesitant pebbles that speak of first returns, the shy, early sediments that tiptoe onto a plain surface after long absence. In many places it does not get these courtesies. It gets clarity instead, and clarity can be unnerving. The lower rock keeps its metamorphic dignity. The upper rock keeps its sedimentary common sense. Their meeting is exact, as if drafted. You reach out and touch deep time with one finger, and a younger sea's floor with the next, and in that spread of knuckles you are living through an interval longer than the distance between the first soft-bodied experiments and the first eyes that could have seen you. Across latitudes, the look of the line adjusts to local styles without losing identity. In one cliff, the contact is almost glossy, as if the planet burnished it by habit. In another, it is faintly irregular, not from indecision, but because weather, like handwriting, never repeats a letter exactly. In some places, a thin rubble sits at the seam, as if the last editor left their eraser crumbs. In others, the two worlds meet with a neatness that suggests ritual. You can imagine weather kneeling there for a long time, making small adjustments. There is comfort in how widely this happens. It means you're not dealing with a trick or an exception, but with a rule expressed with variations. A traveller carrying a folded map in their mind can place pins on coasts and deserts and highlands, and draw a thread through each pin and know that thread is not an invention. It binds together moments where the earth shows you the result of subtraction on a colossal scale without needing to explain the method line by line. Sometimes you walk along a riverbank or a quarry road and the contact dodges behind brush and talus and you think you've lost it. Then a bend, a cut, a new face in a road cut, and there it is again, level as a spirit level, and indifferent to your relief. The planet does not hide or perform, it continues. What you catch depends on where you stand and how much light the hour lends your eyes. If you were to rest on a flat rock at one of these places and count your breath slowly, matching inhales to the gentle arithmetic of waves, you would feel a small alignment take place inside. The missing begins to feel less like an error and more like the necessary clearing before a foundation is poured. Something had to be swept away to make room for the next architecture of seas and sands. The line is not a scar that interrupts the story. It is the neat seam where old strength and new opportunity meet without noise, Objects carry the story even when no cliffs are available. A pebble picked up on a walk contains a history that fits in your palm but occupies a time vault your calendar cannot hold. A slab in a kitchen, a stair in a library, a monument in a park. Many are cut from stones that participated in this arrangement of absence and resumption. People put coffee cups and elbows and wreaths on them without knowing. The ordinary weight of daily living settles on a boundary that crosses novels and serves as a quiet bookmark in the world's long reading. What do you do with a planet that edits itself so effectively? You learn to read negative space. You learn to treat smoothness as a clue, not a convenience. You learn to hold 2 pages open at once and admit the distance between them without forcing a bridge where none remains. This is less about surrender than about accuracy, a softness of mind that comes not from fatigue but from respect. The canyon taught Powell that. Coasts and shields and ranges repeat the lesson for anyone arriving late. At night, when the wind has time to revisit what the day roughed up, the contact persists in the dark as geometry rather than scenery. The upper bed's cool, the lower rock releases the heat it stored, and somewhere along that plane the temperatures pass each other like polite strangers changing shifts. Owls cross it without ceremony. Dew, if the air is willing, collects on both sides equally. The line is not a border for weather or for creatures, it is a border for memory. The mind returns to the image of a book with pages missing, and there is a temptation to lament the loss, as if the librarian had misplaced them. But the library is also the librarian. The shelves build and unbuild themselves with a purpose that includes erasure. And the story that follows the removal is in many places more legible than what would have been there. A fresh start on a planned surface where seas can lay down orderly laminations and early shells can take the hint. The contact in this way is a promise as much as a report. Stand back, as far back as imagination allows, above coasts, above ranges, above the cloud deck, and the planet's surfaces simplify to broad tones and shapes. Yet even at that distance, if you could see with the right kind of attention, you would notice the tendency of continents to carry these quiet plains within their interiors, like ribs in a ship. They control how cliffs fail, how rivers exploit weaknesses, how valleys align. They are not just marks of what is gone. They are structures that guide what remains. So the line that began as a surprise in one canyon becomes a theme. It allows you to walk into a landscape anywhere and ask softly where the missing might be, and often the landscape will answer with a bright edge, a calm shelf, a sudden change of fabric from crystalline to bedded. You kneel, you place your fingertips, you feel the cool and the slightly less cool, and you breathe a little slower because you're holding 2 pages with no mid-story between them, and somehow the lack does not diminish the tale, it sharpens it, and it invites you to keep turning. The neat answer arrives on a cold wind. The world turned white. If 1 billion years are missing, perhaps ice took them. Ice as patient as arithmetic. Ice with the weight to press mountains into manners. Ice that doesn't argue, only abrades. It's a satisfying picture to hold in your hands like a smooth stone. Close your eyes and let it form. Continents wrapped in glass, oceans sealed, the sun striking a bright shell and bouncing away, the planet humming with a higher tinny light. Glaciers grind with the slow authority of sleep, and everywhere they pass they collect and they carry and they forget nothing until they drop it elsewhere as a mixed memory of boulders and mud. If you stand inside that picture, you can almost hear the sandpaper hush that removes what Powell found missing. Clues fell into place like pins on a map, in rocks that once lay close to the equator, where warm rains should have braided the land into friendly rivers. There are scars only ice makes, striations cut in bedrock like notes in a ledger, pavements polished to the lustre of old tools, diamictites where boulders float in a fine matrix like thoughts suspended in fog. In calm water muds, far from shore, single stones appear in tidy layers as if dropped by a careless hand. Those are drop stones, the calling card of melting icebergs, heavy truths released from cold jaws to plunk through soft sediments, leaving little splash crowns of displaced silt that harden into punctuation. Stack enough of these signs and a picture resolves. Ice wandered where it should not have wandered, and it travelled far. Chemistry in the rocks hums the same tune. Above certain glacial layers, a pale, sudden change appears. Thick caps of carbonate that gleam pink or white, as if the planet exhaled and laid a blanket down. They lie directly atop tillites and striated surfaces like a new paragraph that refuses a transition. Their carbon isotopes drift negative, a signature that hints at a world where the cycle of breathing between ocean, rock and sky went strange and then came back. Some iron formations reappear too, iron falling out of seawater as if oceans had turned anoxic in the dark and then met oxygen again. A chemical dawn recorded as stripes. Put these notes together and the melody is simple enough to hum even as you doze. Deep freezes came and deep freezes went, and in between, the Earth's chemistry swung wide. The physics supports the story with a stern nod. Ice reflects sunlight. Reflection cools. Cooling grows ice. More ice reflects more light. A loop that tightens like a patient knot. If the ice advances far enough, the loop runs almost by itself, and the planet can fall into a stable brightness that excludes thaw. Models, when they are in an obedient mood, will show you a world locked into a glittering silence. A snowball whose oceans sleep under thick lids while the atmosphere thins and dries. A faint rattle of wind above white plains. Volcanoes still work in the dark, of course. Earth's heat is durable, and they send up carbon dioxide whether anyone is watching or not. With the oceans shut and weathering stalled, that carbon accumulates, greenhouse trapping heat like a blanket added to a sleeper in a cold room. Eventually warmth sneaks in from below, the mirrors of ice begin to fail, meltwater scribbles on the surface, the shell cracks, the world breathes again. The flood of weather returns, washing calcium and magnesium into seas that promptly build those thick-cap carbonates, a stone memory of sudden, extravagant rain after a long drought. You can rest inside that loop and almost hear it tick, freeze, wait, accumulate, break, then warm, rain, carbonate, reset. It is crisp, elegant, tuck in your blankets bedtime science. But even as you drift, the picture flickers at the edges, the way dreams do when a thought you forgot to finish asks to be heard. If the planet ever froze completely, every ocean sealed and every shore armoured, how did it unfreeze fast enough to match the rock record's tempo? Some glacial episodes seem to end in the space of a geological sigh, shorter than the 10 million year blanket build the models prefer. And if the ocean slept under hard lids everywhere, how did wave ripples form in some layers, tidy oscillations that look like wind had room to play? Some dropstones sit inside sediments that whisper of gentle currents and open water, not total stillness. Regions that should have been drowned in coma show signs of local restlessness. The neat answer begins to develop soft edges. Not wrong, but maybe too pure. A different picture slips into view, more complicated and, in its way, more comfortable. Not a marble of ice, but a slushier sphere with belts of open water where winds could comb the surface and light could go on feeding small, stubborn life. Think of Polynius, those persistent leads in modern polar ice where dark water inhales the sky. Think of cracks working their way across sea ice under tides and storms, of thin places shifting with seasons even in a harsh age. Think of dust darkening snow, lowering albedo, turning mirrors into gentle sponges for sunlight. Think of volcanic soot doing the same. Think of salt brine channels threading the ice like capillaries, small habitats tucked into cold scaffolding. In this picture, glaciers still grind continents bare, but not everywhere at once. Oceans still wear hard roofs in many places, but not always and not forever. The world is not a frozen statue, it's a cold, working machine. Evidence too asks for regional nuance. Some basins record thick, pulsating packages of glacial and interglacial sediments, a cadence of advance and pause, as if the ice tested and retreated, like a careful foot on a creaking stair. Elsewhere, stones etched by ice lie next to evaporates that prefer brine and sun, or to microbial laminites that look like sleeping mats built by communities that persisted even under low blue light. You can imagine shallow water under seasonal ice, thin enough to admit a dim day and sustain the slow, green labour of photosynthesis. You can also imagine high ice grounded on continents, its lobes spilling into shelf seas while deep basins remain calm and black, a layered world with lively edges. Paleomagnetic needles in old minerals point insistently toward low latitudes, insisting that some of that ice skated near the equator. But paleomagnetism is a patient craft that comes with honest error bars and regional quirks. Not every point lands neatly. The story that best fits all the small discomforts is one with texture and drafts. Severe cold, yes, and ice reaching into the tropics, yes, but interrupted by windows and corridors and seasons, by dust and soot and brine that complicate the mirror, by geography that refuses uniformity. The planet loves patterns and also loves exceptions. Both are preserved in stone. Meanwhile, the clean cartoon of an unfreezing planet, CO2 building to some specified atmospheric weight, a switch thrown, a sudden sauna, runs into climate's ability to be both slow and abrupt. When warming came, it might have come in steps, with regional thaws opening the ocean's breath here and there, stirring circulation, moving heat around in filaments and pools before any global cascade took hold. Freshwater caps could linger and insulate. Storms could paint the ice with dust in one season and rinse it in another. Mountain ranges could deflect winds and steer snow as if they were still negotiating with the sky. The world unfreezes like a person wakes, not with one motion, but with many small ones, different limbs at different times, the mind returning in pulses. And then there is timing. The big glaciations you could pin to a wall, long, stern Sturtian, later sweeping Marinoan, bracket and overlap the interval Powell's line implies. Some places hint at a shorter, more local cold after that, a quick breath taken before the day. Not every unconformity knows these names as calendar entries. Some crust cooled and surfaced to weather before the deepest cold took hold, and some perhaps after. The ice answers part of the riddle, a generous part, but not the whole. It is one eraser among others, grand and persuasive, working alongside uplift that lifts rock into wind, alongside rifting that tilts blocks and makes them easy for rain to comb, alongside seas that open shelves wide and then leave them high for weather's spoon. Still, the image of a nearly white planet is hard to abandon, and maybe it shouldn't be. It speaks to the reach of feedbacks you can almost feel on your skin. The brightness of snow, the bite of dry air, the way cold simplifies sound. It's an idea big enough to cradle sleep without dropping you. You can walk along one of those ancient pavements and run your hand over grooves as regular as the strings of a quiet instrument and feel the muscle of ice in your palm. You can stand on Cap Carbonate and sense the gush of ancient rain turn to stone, a storm that went on long enough to lay down meters of after directly on top of before. These are not small acts. They deserve their place in the story the way deep breaths deserve their place between sentences. But the certainty that once sharpened the edges of the snowball softens in contact with the details, and the softening is its own kind of truth. Yes, and is often a better lullaby than only. Yes, ice reached to latitudes where palms would later grow, and yes, it scraped, and yes, it left its cargo far out to sea. And the planet also contained open leads and currents and the kind of stubborn life that makes a living in thin blue rooms under roofs of crystal. Yes, volcanic gases built their blanket in the long dark, and yes, weather returned like a choir, carbonates precipitating in jubilant thickness, And also the warming and the rains likely came in stanzas, not a single shout. Yes, the record is global in feeling, and when you trace it with your finger from canyon to coast to shield, it varies exactly the way a living world varies. If the ice story wavers, it does not fail. It widens. It makes room for a planet that edits with multiple tools, for an absence written by many hands. In the widening, you can settle more deeply, because complexity is cozy for the mind when it doesn't have to perform. You can let ice be one of the great sculptors, a white, slow artisan whose work you can still stroke with your thumb, and you can let other artisans stand beside it, their signatures overlapping in the same clean line Powell traced. The mystery becomes less a single lock, and more a braided cord of causes, and chords hold weight well. Somewhere in the dark, wind freckles a modern lake, and tiny crystals of hoarfrost bloom and sublimate as the air drifts just above and below its dew point. Somewhere else, on a high plain, thin snow takes on dust and learns to drink sunlight instead of throwing it back. The same physics that made ancient ice so persuasive are practicing still, small and continuous. The seam in the canyon waits inside that practice, not explained away, but set into a richer frame, ready for the next force to step forward and add its quiet pressure to the tale that line refuses to finish. Begin with everything gathered, one body of land with a single heartbeat, mountains pressed against mountains until their roots met, rivers with nowhere to run but along the edges, a seam of coast the length of the world. Give that body a name you can whisper without waking yourself, Rodinia. Now give it time, the long kind, the kind that allows pressure to make music of minerals, the kind that lets heat rise and fade and rise again. Inside that warmth, the continent stores stresses the way trees store wind, flexing invisibly, learning where it will crack long before the first sound. Cracking begins as thought. A dike forces its way up like a sentence finding its verb, a black seam of basalt freezing inside pale crust. Another follows, parallel, then a swarm, until the continent wears a set of ribs you can only see in hindsight. Uplift swells along future coasts. Rift shoulders stand up and catch the first real weather they've known in an age. Faults unlock with small clicks, then with long sighs. Valleys open where there were none, and the first thin lakes collect in the new grammar of the land, blue accents in fresh fractures. When a supercontinent breaks, it does not tear cleanly, it unthreads, blocks tilt, basins yawn, arcs detach, and wander like boats cut from their moorings. The tearing is heat-driven and gravity-aided, but what you notice at the surface is simply height and slope. Height invites rain, slope invites rivers, both invite loss. Bare rock that has slept beneath blankets of sediments wakes naked under a sky that has never seen it. Feldspar tastes carbonic acid and concedes to clay. Olivine darkens in air, mica loosens along its books and flakes. The first soils on the first high shoulders are thin and quick, a gesture toward permanence that weather overruns without apology. Every afternoon showers a chisel, every winter freezes a wedge, every thaw is a release. Mountains born on the rift margin are strange mountains. They lift not only because plates collide, but because plates part and isostasy lifts the shoulders, like the edges of a loaf cracking in the oven. When erosion chews those shoulders, the crust, relieved of weight, rises further, keeping heights in play the way a careful hand keeps a toy spinning. Rock that once memorized the dark and the hot is ushered toward the cool and the bright. As it crosses certain temperatures on the way out, the clocks in its grains begin to tick and then to lock. In a zircon lattice, helium diffuses when the world is warm and stays when the world cools. In apatite, tracks slice themselves and anneal until they don't. In mica and feldspar, argon keeps or flees according to thresholds that time will test. Thermochronometers, we call them, but the name is only a ribbon. The thing itself is a diary written by atoms. Take enough of these tiny diaries from cliffs and cores and lonely outcrops, and a map appears that is not a map of roads or rivers, but of cooling. Lines of equal temperature times sweep across continents like isotherms across a weather chart. They bend around rifts, drape over ancient ranges, slice through basins with opinions. Here the cooling is early, 8 or 900 million years ago, like a window thrown open on a hot room. There it is later, 6 or 500, like a door opening at the end of a long hallway. The pattern is not a single winter, it is seasons, and they move. As Rodinia unthreads, magma visits often. Basalt pours from long cracks, making dark, hot carpets the size of nations. Gases lift with it. Water, sulfur, carbon dioxide, writing chemistry into ski and rain. Ash falls into the first rift lakes and makes varves that count years you cannot count. Where fault steps create little shelves, deltas build, topple, build again, their forceps freezing the angle of trust between river and standing water. Coarse arcosic sands tumble from newborn heights into these basins, grains still angular, still pink with feldspar, still carrying the basement's age inside their zircons. Downstream, farther and calmer, the sands fine to silts and clays that settle like breath. If you split those rocks later, your fingers release smells of a climate long forgotten by air. Along the new coasts, because the breaking makes coasts everywhere, shelves develop, wide and shallow and generous with light. In the past, when all was gathered, the ocean was mostly deep basin with narrow fringes. Now the fringes bloom. Tides learn new routes. Currents braid differently. Nutrients, freed from old mountains, come riding down like long-awaited guests. Phosphorus, iron, tiny measures of molybdenum and vanadium, all the quiet wealth of crust loosened by carbonic rain, reach sunlit water and change the arithmetic of life. Stromatolites thicken or thin according to the new rules. Thin mats of microbes drape the seafloor and pump oxygen into places that hadn't kept much. Cut back inland and watch the breakup's other mathematics work. When rain and rivers consume mountains, they also consume carbon dioxide. Silicate weathering is a slow mouth, but given entire ranges to chew, it draws down the sky in steady bites. The carbonate flows to the sea, where carbonate precipitates, and the ledger balances in limestone ledgers many meters thick. The ratio of strontium's isotopes in that limestone shifts, as weathering turns more attention to older continental rocks. You can hold a powdered sample to a mass spectrometer's ear, and hear the continents break up in a faint change of tone. These are not metaphors to the stones, they are memory. Between the rift shoulders, lengths of continent sag into passive margins, their drama quieted, their task now to subside and receive. The Iapetus, call it an ocean even in its youth, spreads between separating fragments. Along its young edges, the first great sandstones of a new regime begin to accumulate in sheets so broad they look like patients fossilized. Crossbeds freeze dunes that had a favourite wind. Raindrop imprints salt, small punctuation on muds that dry under sun. The sea taste in the rock shifts in chemistry and in trace fossils as shallow worlds complicate. You can walk these tongues of sand and lime and read each set as a chapter, begun on a planned surface that feels suspiciously like the kind of surface Powell traced with his finger. This is how absence becomes platform. The great unconformity is not made in a single storm. It is made by the long coincidence of uplift and exposure, of highlands unveiled and kept high by an elastic crust, of climates pushed to cold and pulled to warmth by feedbacks the breaking itself strengthens and loosens. In one province, erosion begins first and never quite lets up, shaving kilometres from a roof until the rafters show. In another, sediments linger for a time, protecting, then vanish when tilt feeds rivers fresh slopes to chase. Fault blocks rise and lie on their sides. Beveling planation surfaces sweep across them, dressing different lithologies to the same level like a barber with a steady hand. What remains below is tough and twisted and old. What will arrive above is horizontal and younger, and full of new intentions. Stand for a while with a grain of sand pinched in your damp fingers. Its zircon is small enough to overlook and large enough to date a craton. A laser will pluck a rim spot that says, "I cooled when this mountain died," and a core spot that says, "I crystallized when that magma stilled." The grains trip from basement to beach caches both ages in one body. Multiply by trillions of grains, by thousands of rivers, by millions of seasons of transport, and the detrital signal turns into a choir. Basin by basin, that choir tells you which piece of Rodinia once stood upwind and how fast it fell. The peaks themselves are gone. Their songs remain, caught in beaches that became sandstones that became mesas that watch a different sea. While this unthreading continues, life is not idle. It is still mostly small and quiet, but it senses edges and uses them. A shelf that once lay dark now receives noon at the bottom. Microbes thicken their mats and stiffen the mud with films. Storms roll in over shallow water and tear the mats and roll them into scrolls that harden. And later, someone splits a slab and smiles at the tidy tubes like rolled rugs. Oxygen strolls farther into water and lingers there longer. Iron, which once wandered dissolved, precipitates as rust and stains rocks with a warmth that sunlight later emphasizes. Currents that used to sink now rise. Ventilation that once failed now works just enough. And animals that are not animals yet find room for experiments. Add rumbles at the margins where new oceans subduct against older arcs. While one side of a supercontinent relaxes into passive indulgence, another side feels teeth again. Mountains rebuild where they never really slept, and their erosional shadows lengthen. Sediment fans stack thick and coarsen upward. Conglomerates record pulses of uplift as plainly as heart monitors. The breakup is not a neat divorce. It is a collage of separations and new marriages, and every union and parting has topography with consequences for weather and for water, and thus for what survives and what erodes and what is preserved. If you could time-lapse the whole business from a patient distance, say, the distance of a moon that liked geology, you would see bright lines of magma darting across the continent like light under a skin. You would watch shoulders heave, roofs pop, and long gullies deepen into corridors. You would see sheets of sediment slide seaward, pausing, compacting, then sliding again like breaths. You would watch the basement peep out, reluctant at first and then frankly exposed, its foliation catching low sun, its hardness refusing to be styled by anything but time. Over and over, the camera would show the same sequence: uplift, planation, calm. And above the calm, stacks that look almost indecently orderly, as if the planet were tidying before company. There are places where the unconformity bevel runs for tens of kilometers at the same height, slicing different rocks to a common surface. Geomorphologists love these as teachers. They show how process blurs material difference when the chisel is applied long enough and broadly enough. There are other places where the bevel undulates, preserving knobs of tougher lithology like islands in a low-relief sea. These highs seed later hills and dictate later rivers in a quiet tyranny of inheritance. The line Powell admired is a contact, yes, but it is also a template. Future landscapes borrow their bones from it. Basalt provinces pour, cool, crack, and fill with zeolites that sparkle when you break them with fresh curiosity. Beneath them, the crust warms and flexes. Above them, the sky thickens briefly with aerosols that push and pull at sunlight. Downwind, rain grows faintly more acidic and learns the taste of long-trapped minerals. Basalts darken surfaces and lower albedo in patches large enough to matter. They seed snowmelt in places you'd expect snow to linger. The climate system listens and answers in the same deep rhythm that ice listened to earlier, and volcanism listens to now. All the while, the unconformity keeps learning itself. In some sections, a thin veneer of rubble pauses at the seam, a lag that says the first new rivers did not have far to shop for gravel. Elsewhere, The first beds above the line are clean sand laid by a sea that returned with a level patience, a tabula rasa that fish will one day learn to cross. In a few protected basins the missing interval narrows, preservation outwits scouring for a time, a sliver of mid-story survives behind a structural curtain. The big picture does not require uniformity, it requires coherence, and coherence is what the thermochron clocks and the provenance grains and the bevels in the hills keep giving across continents that now face different suns. At night in the field, a person can sit on the edge of a passive margin cliff and hear small stones clicking down a talus, each a syllable in a language that erosion speaks whether anyone is awake to listen. In the notebook, lines cross. Ages, thicknesses, flow directions strike and dip. In the blood, a quieter line crosses, the one that connects a seam traced by fingertips to the larger understanding that seems like it form when continents breathe out. Breakup is not only a ripping, it is also an exhalation that cools the deep and dresses the shallow and sets a table of shelves and nutrients and light. The breath is long, the table is wide, the next guests are already on their way. What's gone can be gentle. The mind meets that idea with suspicion at first, because we're taught to love long unbroken lines, stories with every scene, timelines with no torn edges. But the line Powell touched is a soft tutor in subtraction. It shows you a clean absence, not a wound but a seam, a quiet surface made by patient work so that something else could be set upon it. The missing billion becomes a kind of pillow, long, level, supportive. Lay your thoughts there for a moment. Let them settle into the plane that the weather made and the rivers finished and the seas accepted, and notice how stillness can hold you as surely as detail ever did. There's a reason this comforts you at the edge of sleep. Your brain is an archiving animal. It wants to file the day in perfect order, every minute labelled. But sleep asks for a different librarian. Sleep wants someone who knows which papers to set aside for morning and which to shred, who can make a simple surface out of the day's topography. The great unconformity is that metaphor in stone. It says, clear room, then build. It says, the clean page isn't the absence of work, it's the result of work. When the mind waits for perfect continuity, the night stretches tight and thin. When the mind accepts a planned skip, the night thickens and becomes bearable. You're not giving up, you are making space. Breathe in for 4, hold for 2, breathe out for 6. While you exhale, picture the planet as it edited itself. Mountains rising on the backs of faults, weather walking in with small sharp tools, glaciers smoothing what they could reach, rivers filing every edge down to a common level. Eras of patient removal that would have looked like nothing much on any given afternoon. Then imagine a tide creeping across that planed surface, laying down new layers in soft pulses that go countable, countable, countable in your chest. Absence becomes foundation. Foundation becomes rhythm. Rhythm becomes the lull your body recognizes more easily than any words. Even the biology in the story is soporific when you hear it right. The nutrients freed by erosion, phosphorus, iron, quiet trace metals, were not thrown away. They were carried as offerings into shallow seas that hadn't existed before. There, light could finally reach bottom in large friendly rooms, and tiny lives made use of the gift. Oxygen rose and lingered, and the oceans learned to breathe more deeply and more often. Later, the crowded inventiveness we call the Cambrian arrived, not as a sudden shout from nowhere, but as a choir stepping onto a stage someone had swept clean and lit. Your breath is a small version of that long arrangement. Empty a little, then the next inhale can carry farther. Make room, then fill. When you soften into that idea, the day's puzzles stop demanding their missing chapters right now. The email without an answer, the conversation that paused on a sharp edge, the plan that hasn't earned its middle, each can sit on the smooth contact for a night. You're not denying the gap, you're declining to stuff it with what-ifs. The rock is honest about its missing volume. your mind can be honest about its unfinished business. Touch the lower oldness with one thumb, everything you've already survived, the pressure you've endured, the crystal habits you've learned, and touch the upper newness with the other, everything you're building next, the lamination of habits, the simple beds of routine. Between your hands is a calm you can actually feel. Do a body scan like a geologist reading a wall. Forehead, old basement, dense with thought, let it cool. Eyes, cross-bedded from screens and motion, let the angles relax. Jaw, faulted, locked, let weather in. A little rain of ease, tiny pebbles of tension tumble free. Shoulders, uplifted margins, allow isostasy to work. As you release weight, they rise and then settle at a kinder elevation. Hands, tools put down, open your fingers the way a delta opens to the sea. Ribs, shelves, wide and shallow, let light reach them. Belly, basin, let sediment settle. Let the last swirls of wakefulness drop like silt. Legs, long rivers, no hurry now. The slope can be gentle. Feet, shoreline. Trust the ebb. When you're done, the landscape of you feels newly planed, ready for quiet deposition, sleep arriving like slack tide. Part of why this helps is the permission it gives the brain to be incomplete. Deep time is uninterested in tidy closure. It improves the story by letting some chapters vanish and others begin on clean planes. There's grace in that kind of editing. Think of the habits that fell away when they needed to, the friendships that became bedrock by losing their chatter, the projects that scattered and fertilized other parts of your life. Even your own memory already carries unconformities, edges where decades touch with little connective tissue, and yet your story is not broken. It is readable, because the mind, like the earth, knows how to use a seam. You can practice the geology of forgetting without losing anything that matters. On your next breath out, choose one puzzle and set it on the bevel. Not forever, just until morning. Notice the reflex that wants to populate the gap with worst-case rubble. Then let the bevel reject it. The contact is clean. New layers will only adhere in thin, orderly sheets. Sleep, then breakfast, then one small action. The rest of the junk, the scree of invented consequences, rolls off and clatters somewhere you do not have to visit tonight. A planned surface is picky in a helpful way. Absence also changes scale in your favour. When the world was gathered into Rodinia, the deep ocean was the default, lightless, scarce, unhelpful to the complex dreams that would come later. After the edit, the margins multiplied and shallowed, bright rooms where small experiments could finally accumulate into new bodies. Your days can be like that. One long undifferentiated stretch of doing steals light from the floor. A clean pause, walk, tea, a short look out a window, 10 slow breaths, multiplies coasts inside a day. The margin is where the interesting life takes hold, and margin is made by subtraction. If your thoughts cling, give them a texture to hold that isn't worry. Imagine a cap of limestone forming above ancient till, drop by drop of carbonate building a soft pale ceiling where there had been cold grit. Each drop is a counted breath. Inhale, water holds carbon. Exhale, rock lets it go. Under that ceiling are dim rooms where soft-bodied things learn to share space. Above it, later, shells and eyes and muscles appeared. The ceiling is not a barrier, it's a record of a calm that made the next complexity possible. Let your ceiling thicken for a while tonight. It's not an end, it's a pause recorded so that morning can remember what you meant to do with your energy. There is a small fear that relaxing into incompleteness means you will forget too much or never finish. The canyon answers by existing. The gap did not erase the lower rock's character, it emphasized it. It did not prevent the younger layers from accumulating, it enabled them to begin in order. You do not lose yourself by resting. You show your structure and invite the right things to stack. Think of sleep as passive margin time, subsidence at just the right rate, accommodation space created by you doing nothing so that tomorrow's sands and silts can arrive without crumpling. When the mind insists on a precise timeline, remind it gently that clocks live in crystals and can wait. Zircons kept their ages through burial and heat and re-exposure. They did not demand to be read in real time. Your problems, like those ages, will still be there in the morning, crisp and more legible for having cooled. A cooled problem is a dated problem. A dated problem is easier to place and easier to move. Tonight, your only isotope ratio is the measure of inhale to exhale and the patient decay of wakefulness into rest. Even the idea of erasure can be kind when you reframe it. The missing billion is not lost joy or erased meaning. It is material that went to sea to feed futures. Your discarded thoughts will wash into places where they can become quieter, or sediment into pages where they can be read without urgency. You do not need to watch them travel. The river is good at its job. Let it braid in the dark. If a worry returns, set it down again as many times as needed. Think of plantation surfaces sweeping across stubborn knolls. It takes passes. Each pass lowers the relief a little. The knoll remains, but its sharpness goes. Your fear can remain, and yet stop snagging your sleeve. Eventually the bevel is broad enough that anything placed on it sits without rolling. That is the feeling you're seeking. Not the vanishing of thought, but the stability of thought placed where it cannot hurt you. You can even borrow the planet's feedbacks. Light equals wakefulness. Reflection keeps you bright. Dim the mirrors. Screen off, lamp low, curtains mostly closed. Let your room become less snowball, more shelf. Sound equals weather. Stillness lets sediments settle. Lower the volume of the day until only a few slow waves cross the floor. Temperature equals invitation. A degree cooler invites blankets and the mammal certainty of safety. Having arranged that climate, trust the physics. The system will move towards sleep the way water moves toward lower ground. All the while, keep near the first image. Powell's fingertip resting on a line neither he nor anyone could cross with a step. A seam older than the idea of nations. A hush wedged between two kinds of rock, each true to itself. The line didn't argue, it offered. It said, "This is where the next story starts," and the planet agreed, laying down sand and lime until lives with eyes could look back and wonder. You're allowed that kind of beginning every night. Smooth what can be smoothed. Accept the clean skip. Let the new lay down gently in order. If you're almost asleep, good. Let the words keep working like low tide combing a beach. If you're still awake, place your hand on your chest and feel for the small, regular crossbeds of your breath. Each set leans the same way. Each pause marks a surface where nothing is lost and everything can begin again. Outside, wind may be moving across trees or the side of a building, shaping small unconformities in dust you'll never see. Inside, your mind is learning to do the same, planing down what tried to stand too tall today, making a calm plane for tomorrow's thin, bright layers to take hold. There is more of the story waiting just past this quiet, and you're already drifting toward it. And that's where we leave the line in stone, old beneath, young above, and a calm, meaningful silence in between. If your eyes are heavy, let the missing billion keep watch for you tonight. The earth has held longer nights than this and always remembers how to turn the page. Breathe in like a tide crossing a plain shore. Breathe out like sand settling, countable, gentle, enough. If this journey helped you drift, tap subscribe so you can find your way back here whenever the day runs too loud and before you fall all the way under. Tell me in the comments where in the world you're listening from and what time it is there. Your dots on the map are my favourite constellation. Sleep well, traveller of deep time. I'll meet you again on the next quiet page.